All right. Well, this is Roman with Philosophisn't. I'm here with Louis Pitts, a lifelong lawyer and advocate for social justice, to discuss what I learned from his biography, The Life of a Movement Lawyer. This biography details the intellectual and the moral foundations of Louis's work. He's here with me now to discuss it today. How are you, Louis?
Hey, Roman. Thank you for letting me be here with you to talk about this.
Certainly. Morgan really recommended that I speak to, and when I started to read the book at Scuppernong, I wasn't disappointed. It's you had quite a childhood growing up. You had quite a change from what life was like growing up to what your advocacy became as a lawyer. And so the first thing I want to ask is, what was it like to experience the feeling that you started to understand that some of the things that you did in your childhood, that the town you grew up in, that the people had beliefs that were really wrong? I mean, there was the episode in the book about people putting long live the KKK as a prank, and that's just not who you are at all now. Was it really just like that innocent, like people didn't know? It kind of, it shook me to read about that.
Yeah, well, I guess that was our Jason's point. You know, I grew up in South Carolina, and I say sometimes to people, mostly serious, that I was born, raised, and miseducated in South Carolina. So when you're growing up in the South in the United States, and further, but so much so because of the Confederacy, you are marinated in the white supremacist doctrines. And it can take different ways. And, when I was growing up, my parents were not in the Klan. They thought that was, bad stuff. But they probably believed in separate but equal, rather than, meaning you don't mix and those things. But at least, so I didn't notice that I was anything but normal. So I bought a raffle ticket for a Mustang from a member that was raising money for the KKK. And I had no intent that was doing anything mean. I just didn't know. Now, you could stay in that level of ignorance by choice if your attitudes start to work you towards you dislike and your prejudice seems natural to you and you're getting a benefit. You could be stuck there. But I think most people, particularly now, but you begin to open your eyes as you grow a little more. When you get to go out of town for the first time and then go out of the county or go out of the city or travel, you begin to get exposed to that. So I began to think a little bit better when I was going at the college years.
You started to read Marx, Will Durant, and Bertrand Russell, if I remember.
I sure did. And I have to say, because it's in the book, and because that was 1968 or 9 or so, I smoked pot. So I think I say Bertrand Russell and that helped open my mind. Now, obviously, you don't want to abuse anything, whether it's aspirin or Budweiser or a drug. But the point is to be freed up in your thinking to assess things on their merits, including ideologies and beliefs.
Well, tell me more about Bertrand Russell, because he's a philosopher who I haven't really read much about. I've learned about Wittgenstein, but not Bertrand Russell, who was Wittgenstein's mentor.
Well, I'm not a philosophy trained person, but I enjoy. I think what I would say, he was a free thinker.
Right.
That he expressed that, and he was therefore had more freedom and was more out of sync with the power structure. He and Einstein were ones very much knew that we needed to do something to end the atomic bombing, and not continue doing it after we did that. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's that. And he has an essay called "Why I'm Not a Christian."
Right.
And I thought that was a new, different way from my thinking, and I wanted to read about that. And he was also sort of irreverent towards, as opposed to shaping his whole life to fit
Well,
into
in
a power
his-
structure. But
In his book, Bertrand Russell's I don't want to go too deep into this,
yeah,
but that was the only book I could find in the bookstore that was by him, and he wrote about Christianity as actually containing like a lot of pagan elements, like Ishtar actually becoming the Virgin Mary, and that was like, well, what do you think of that? As someone who, because the book mentions you grew up Methodist.
yeah.
Is it,
Well, of his thinking, or what was my religious beliefs?
what was your response to it? Did reading Bertrand Russell, because the book says you grew up Christian, so I'm
Yeah.
curious. Would you still consider yourself Christian now or spiritual? Like,
I'm very spiritual, more on the Eastern side.
Yes.
I wouldn't say I'm a Buddhist or a Zen, but that's more it. I mean, when you add religion and the institution to some good thoughts and good ideology, you usually get a big problem because it becomes dogmatic and then you have sectarian stuff. But some of the teachings, I guess the ones that most we associate with Jesus, about loving your neighbor,
right.
being friends, and you have a duty for the poor and oppressed. The Catholics call it a preferential option for the poor and oppressed. I like that stuff. I'm not going to say I believe
And the book
it.
says that you strongly believe that there's no such thing as bad people, only people who do bad things.
Right. Well,
That was interesting to me.
I do believe that, but I'm also aware, because I did some work in the field,
Right.
there's some, best I can tell, chemically based brain imbalance, mental illnesses that cause people to hear voices and do very serious harm, kill people, and
Yeah.
that thing. So we have to have a
Because if
management
something's
system.
not voluntary, like you can't stop the voices, then how can we? I actually had a similar thought recently. Like if something's not voluntary, if it's caused by mental illness, that's why you have the insanity defense, and that's why
Right.
you have like a different set of considerations.
Right.
But still, I think to say that there's no bad people, it certainly comes across as rather radical, don't you think?
Right.
Especially the way we want to think in the day-to-day world. It sort of gives us closure to say, oh, he did that because he's a bad person. He did that because he's a bad person. Is that like a belief that you've moved away from,
Well,
or you've had to reckon with, rather?
I think the at least the idea when I hear that or talk about is is a better way to put it would be that you don't judge and define a person by their worst behavior. You if you will, you pitch to, or as Reverend Nelson John saw, you walk towards their highest chords of humanity. Means you may have to then forgive the transgression if it was against you, or not strike them out, because life is hard and people make mistakes. I think that's how I would see that. I think with a particular, if you will, legal connotation, the criminal justice system here is just horrible. Probably worse. We incarcerate more people per capita, I think, literally than any other country. Talk about Russia and China. They're supposed to be so terrible that we got to always be building military bases all around their country.
I'm really someone who's outside the law. Like I studied political science and economics. When I had to study laws for my thesis, I didn't know how to cite laws. It's a very foreign world to me. But so I watch the news about like trials, like most everyone does, and the prosecutor always says something like we need this punishment, we need this justice so that it will bring closure to the victims. And that seems to be, at least in cases that get publicized a lot, that I as a casual follower will read about, that always seems to be the line that they default to. And maybe that's not true, because you probably have an idea of restorative justice, of like you just said, seeing the people for their highest chords. And so how do you even begin to think of a justice system that begins to do that?
Well, the one we have, as I was just citing, is horrible. It incarcerates. It doesn't rehabilitate at all. I think it's important to make a fundamental statement. That's my belief, is that this legal system here, frequently and usually, wherever it is designed to protect the current system, and since day one was put in place to protect primarily the property rights. So you begin to get a structure that's already, and usually, virtually always, ends up being the violent force, the use of armed violence to reinforce and protect certain people. And that usually is the rich and the well-born. Alexander Hamilton, the famous play that's out now. His thing back then was we need to have the rich and the well-born that run the country.
And that's like what happened in Contra, or in the case of Kerr McGee being poisoned, right?
Right.
You see that pattern?
Yes. That's what this struggle is. It seems so overly simplistic. And yet our nation, and then when you have this wealth, and it develops an entity through the use of the Supreme Court, literally back in 1886, that a corporation, a railroad company, was a person with constitutional rights. You've just set in place a justification for them to have rights that supersede human beings, corporations.
Yes.
And that's the status we have. So it's who has the most money in the country. Isn't it usually always the ones who inherit it, maybe from their whatever? But it's the giant corporations, and including finance and banks. And we have such
There's a lot of collusion, is what you're saying. So that's something that interested me a lot that I wanted to ask about.
Sure.
Because in the case in Allendale, in Karen Silkwood's case, she was a union organizer that went against her company for negligence, and there was some really, really suspicious circumstances that the FBI was actually colluding with that company. She was found with the radioactive poisonous substance in her house, basically. And so while the campaign was successful awarding damages to Silkwood, do you feel that it was able to impact the precedent of how corporations abuse workers, of how workers can fight back against abuse, rather?
Yeah, it helped a lot at that time, because that was part of, there were sort of aspects combined in that one case. It was a woman, a whistleblower. It was the health and safety issues, physics, and you're standing in, she would talk about standing in milky colored water. It's probably plutonium and stuff in it. But many of people used it. There was a big movie made out of it, and it could, but the dominant culture itself, which is controlled by that money, fights against that catching hold, because everywhere you would get the chance to make policy decisions or laws that would not be hostile to and maybe even boost labor to be able to have a power, labor and workers, where the majority of people do their thing, would have a fair shake. Those people don't have the access to the money to run the candidates that take more of the business side of things. So the answer is yes, that movement that you were just pointing to, of the people saying, look, we all came together, we fought this lawsuit, we publicized it, and look, they did wrong according to a jury. Let's turn that into have some meaning. And that was a wonderful thing. We have to keep doing it. That's why it's called the struggle. And most people call it protracted struggle. Because to preserve liberty is sort of a never-ending thing, because there's always some counter-revolutionary forces. Yeah. In this day's world, those counter-revolutionary forces who would be trying to, say, in the Middle East and these countries, and like Iran, when the people get in power, somehow elect somebody that says, we need to nationalize our oil companies. Right. And all that selling we do, the extra money called profit, comes back to the people. Right. Not to these U.S. subsidiaries and stuff. When they elect a leader like that, the U.S. subverts it. And that's really, overtly. Are you saying that that's really what the Contragate scandal was about? What it was. It wasn't about like a genuine ideological preference for like democracy or liberalism. It was, can you just explain that? Exactly was that. Yeah. It was the ideological framework which they bring to put this kind of simple, but we got to start where, is capitalism and so-called free enterprise.
Right.
Okay, so therefore, the whole theory there is the rich and the well-born, or people who are the most competent, will own, and they get to make profit by hiring people to work with them. And when they get that profit, they can end up making more. That's the way the U.S. wants to do it.
What
Was happening in Nicaragua? There'd been like 50 years of a dictator who was in the back pocket of the U.S. So he got to roll on, but the people they had a popular people's revolution in 1979, and took power, and the U.S. started meddling to try to militarily fund money militarily to aid the Contras, who were the counter-revolutionaries. Well, I don't know if this may be too deep, but it's a part of history. I lived through it. You didn't, so it'd be really worth seeing the key points there. So the U.S. is undermining the people's, because they just won't be one of our puppets. It was just as simple as that. And yet Congress said to Reagan, when Reagan went in, that Congress said, you can't do anything to overthrow the Sandinista.
And Reagan found ways to subvert that.
Exactly.
He sort of had, that's what I planned to ask about, because
go ahead.
There was such a labyrinth of liability that it's like, instead of one person coordinating it in a very direct way, it was one person did this on behalf of this admin who was able to do it because of the directorate issued by that admin. And so it's very contrary to the way we think of checks and balances, like in the ordinary textbook sense, as a government being open, isn't it? And you faced I can't remember the institute you worked with, but that faced the Christic. So that institute faced a coordinated defamation campaign and legal sanctions. And basically the law was weaponized against you because you were accused of weaponizing the law against Reagan, right?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Wow. It was a hell of a story. We've set up that Reagan was defying its own Congress.
Yes.
Well, the distinction today is we don't have, in terms of wars and this ideology playing out of who's going to control the world. You see, that's what is grounded in the same thing. So when Reagan was president, his vice president was Bush, the daddy Bush, who had, prior to this point of being a senator and getting up in Congress, he had been the director of the CIA.
Right.
So all that dirty co-op secret stuff that he does there, he was vice president. He's going to be running for president. All that time Contragate was going on, he was saying, I didn't know anything about any of this, man. I'm just running for president. I was out of the loop.
Right.
Because Reagan and Oliver North, those are the ones that were categorically caught.
But that wasn't true, what he was saying.
But what he was saying is totally true. We got the memos and all kind of things to show he knew all about it.
Right.
We've tracked the person that flew up from Honduras, I think it was El Salvador, to meet with the VP to talk about. We had U.S. copters in all and around trying to surround the Sandinista Nicaragua to overthrow them. We were going to war with them. And we had that on him, and he wouldn't answer any questions. They would take some kind of privilege, executive privilege or national security privilege, but there was no question that he was in on it. I guess the larger point there is at the geopolitical level, when we're talking about U.S. wanting to demand and control the world in the interest of the few but growing rich billionaires.
Right.
If any country or any even person makes too much of us, begins to creep through with the truth about how corrupt that part is, they go after you.
Right.
If it's another country, we wage war or we starve them by these
all the populist
sanctions.
Presidents in our country who are challenged the financial system.
So you just impose these sanctions and it kills people indiscriminately. So you're getting at these are big, heavy questions, because I'm 76 years old. I was a lawyer for over 40 years and I've been an activist. largely doing sort of exposing police misconduct, racist police misconduct. But I wish I could say without it sounding so simple-mindedly cynical, is that for you young people, most of the cultural and ideological core beliefs that you think you might be getting, at least facts about who's doing what, are bullshit.
Right.
It's made up. It's a big spin on it, but and don't have this needless faith that you can tinker with it too much more.
Well, I'm curious, with power being exercised on behalf of capitalists, I agree that it's true. What I'm not sure I agree with is whether that's something that's inherent to capitalism, or if that's the nature of all centralized systems.
Right.
Like if you look at what the Soviet Union did to the peasants, for example, where it was all what the bureaucrats wanted and the peasants were forced to move into large collective farms against their will. When you look at like what China did to people like my family, collectivization wasn't quite as bad as in the Soviet Union. But my mom is from China. She tells me stories from that time. And the people in charge aren't remembered in like a warm or fuzzy way. They're remembered as bureaucrats who took the best part of the produce of the fields for themselves.
Right.
That was supposed to be public produce. And so I'm curious, as a lawyer, as someone deeply involved in public affairs, what actually is your view about breaking this cycle in human history? Is it capitalism that has to go, or is it something in the human mind that has to go?
Well, good question. That's one that we can go. Never to be.
I mean, you don't have to give like a perfect answer. It's sort of speculative.
Yeah,
but I feel like, at least for me, I'm always thinking about it. That's kind of like the biggest question on this show, actually, Philosophisn't.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interconnectedness. The priority of which should go to each side depends on the concrete circumstances.
Yes.
It can change. We obviously need to change our way of thinking right now. So, because too many people think U.S. is the greatest country it's ever been, U.S. exceptionalism, and we're entitled to rule the world, and we're doing everything right. And that there is no other vision. We can't envision anything else. It's a little bit playing on. You're thinking, if all these other countries are the bad, what's the difference? Why don't we keep the one that's working for us? Well, so there is an idea of changing, but
let me ask it this way.
Capitalism has an inherent flaw in it. There's books written about it that are way more complicated than I understand, and Marx did a great job of laying. But when the owning class, they own the capital, that's why it's called capitalist, and they buy people $8 an hour or $25, and some people get a salary, and when they start with something, these raw materials, if you will, including labor, as if it was leather for a shoe.
It's commodification of labor.
It's the commodification of labor.
I'm very familiar with that theory.
Yeah, and then when then that happens, that's the cap. They hire and pay in the product, and then they sell that product for something that's a profit.
Right.
Where did it come from?
It can only come from labor, because if you buy a machine, then you can only extract the value that you paid for the machine. And so that's called the labor theory of value, the theory of surplus value. I'm very familiar with that. So that means that that's always been a hard theory for me to understand.
So good. I'm glad you said it better than I did. But to me, that makes that we have to change away from a profit-driven system where it's all but written down in big golden letters, but they do it more subtly. Is that you get to make that profit? That's how it all has to work.
Well, there's also the other reason for profit is that it's in a competitive market, a profit is a signal. So if you're making profit selling crops, this is how. It's worth exploring this logic at least.
Yeah, sure.
Then other people are going to be incentivized to join in, and there's going to be more competition, and they're going to lower that profit. But what Marx argued was that because the only way to increase profits due to that excess of competition in this system where it's so dog eat dog, in order to take the pressure off of competition, capitalists shift that onto exploitation of workers. Because if capitalists, you actually see this empirically speaking, like in industries that are highly mechanized, the rate of profit's actually lower. Because the cost is already inbuilt into the machines. The cost is actually sunken into the machines, and so there's no further value that can be extracted from that, because the machines will wear down, and the additional value that you could extract from a machine is like it's already priced into the cost of buying that machine.
Right.
So it's what you're saying is something very, very. It's a very complex theory, yeah.
In the DNA, I think, of capitalism, to have that, because somebody accumulates, and there's got to be an expense. It's designed for profit, not for people and what serves them. But now, what that leads into, these big clumsy things, is even during the Sandinista period, I think at most it was maybe even only 1/3 publicly controlled sectors. They kept a free enterprise or a marketing or some version of a marketing thing going. Because I think when you try to come in too clumsy and say we've got a people's revolution now, and I think that's what happened probably in Russia and China, as they're trying to stumble through a development phase, is, well, we got to order everybody to do it, so you end up throwing people in prison and being, as opposed to you could, like the Sandinistas were doing in Nicaragua, have a mixed economy. You know, look, we have the dominant economy here, which is cutthroat capitalism, Wall Street, finance, war, armament, contractors.
Well, my question is, with that, if I've always had this this curiosity about the question of whether history is moved by national interests or whether history is moved by class interests. Because why would the U.S. public be okay with this? Why would the U.S. public be okay with it if the world is, as you describe, like only for the people at the very top? Do you think that the exploitation that goes on in third world countries benefits, like, say, like an American middle class person, because then they get cheap products from the third world countries?
Yes. That's the exploitation of the U.S.-led West NATO folk and the global South.
So then it's really more than just the people at the top who are the problem. It's middle ordinary people have to accept.
Well, liberals is a good version of the ones that are so hostile and can't bring themselves to read about and consider as possible, because it's working fine for them in a way. And so why wouldn't it work? So. But that it takes us back to, is it, so I'm saying if we can use the ideas to show, let's try a mixed economy and at least fix ways that the dominant, exclusive nearly motive is profit, but put it to be the well-being, the general well-being, the common welfare, all those words in the preface to the U.S. Constitution of the general welfare out there. That's very contradiction with what we actually live out in this.
Well, I want to bring the conversation back to law.
Sure.
And like I said, I'm a real outsider to law, but this question relates to what it means to have a just society, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's two schools of thought that I learned about of what the law should be in order to have a just society. And one is the school of living law, and this idea is that if you follow law by the letter, that it leads to absurd outcomes, given the original intention of the law is to have like freedom and equality. And for example, like in gun law debates, when people argue that the right to bear arms cannot be interpreted to apply to AR-15s or assault rifles, then they're kind of espousing like the living law theory of law. It's the other hand, textualism says that in order to have an uncompromising interpretation, one that's impartial, that's not subjective to any individual interest or particular interest, and to prevent the law from being an arbitrary power, that even if the outcome kind of seems absurd, it seems that it's still best overall to have
textual reading.
Yeah, a textual reading, just
originalism,
original interpretation of the law, exactly. And so what have your experiences shown you, or is this debate just kind of irrelevant in real life? Law is academic thing?
Very good point.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can try to say something not too long-winded. The law is set there to essentially ensure the status quo stays the same. So,
well, it gets very complicated because there's also cases where if people, where people who are in the status quo economically could be textualists or could be willing to bend the law if it suits their interests.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's no question about it.
So I don't think you can just say that like the constitutionalists would always be status quo and textualists would always be more humanist.
No, I don't think. I think the textualist and the originalist would be the ones that would be saying we have to follow the same rules as we did prior to slavery. You know, that notion, what were those old geezers back then, the so-called founding fathers and the subsequent generations of those people who got into that through wealth? You know, what would they be saying?
Well, what I mean is there's also, I actually misspoke, there's also cases where the people who are in the status quo economically could actually prefer the living law interpretation, the fluid interpretation of law, if that allows them to disregard ethical principles in times when those principles actually favor the disenfranchised. Right. Like, for example, I think I really see this with free speech debates. Like, it's usually big tech companies and people who are already in the privileged position in society who are more willing to do away with free speech. Right. Like on campus debates, for example, there was the issue of student speech being considered threatening. Like, does this cross the border into harassment if it makes people feel uncomfortable? And it's like, well, how can you have a protest that allows everyone to feel comfortable? Like
you're totally right.
So I've met people who are like very, very like progressive politically, but very kind of constitutionalist legally. One of these people is Ed Kyohoho, and he told me that, like, you know, I've always believed in the Constitution, even though his view of history is like a left-wing view of history. He views like that there's that he's Hawaiian by descent, and he told me that like the white man basically just took over Hawaii and exploited it for its resources. But despite that, he says, you know, I always believe in the Constitution because the Constitution is the basis from which society can move forward, even though it was like created in flawed times.
Right.
But if you have a devotion to always interpreting law in the same way, you remove that subjective human element. You remove the if there's a judge who wants to interpret the laws in a subjective way in favor of the powerful, then a true originalist, someone who's really devoted to only interpreting the law, would oppose that judge.
Right. And I think the law isn't static. We have precedent, so you're supposed to be bound by what used to be. But there's a notion in there that I think we have to, it's not that explicit anywhere, evolving standards of moral decency. See, that surely that's a touchstone of what our nation is about. And when our nation should long ago realize that slavery was an abomination, then you can't keep saying, well, we used to do it, so we get to keep doing it. No. The law changes. And there's an evolvement almost everybody. When it starts to evolve towards which class of people, and whether that class of people have a meaningful set of voices at the decision-making spot, Supreme Court, and decides your answer. And given that it's the moneyed class that pays for all these campaign ads now, and it's pretty well established that the person who can muster the most money is going to win their party or their whatever. And so we got to get that thumb down on the scale, which is the money part of it, and start to have elections, start to pick judges. And I tend to be agreeing with your Hawaiian friend that we need a baseboard, a grounding, the Constitution. There's some nice principles. I'd do away with electoral college, a lot of stuff you could fix with, but you got to have your social contract that says things about we're about the general welfare and lay down categorically that you're not a theocracy and you're not a monarchy. That this is supposed to be something very, very different. That's what we are. If we're going to be proud about the American, it let sort of the genie out of the bottle, that there should be, which it took from the founding, 1776, from the 1789 with the Constitution, all the way up to Lincoln and Gettysburg Address, saying government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if you think about that, that is totally revolutionary, because we don't have that.
Right.
All the polls show, all the things people want, universal health care and arms, gun control, we don't get it. Because that voting crowd from your city council up to be in various degrees, but at the federal level, where it's solidified now, the billionaire class is who told Biden to step down. And there's still these people writing their op-eds, these national columns. Oh, and Biden was such a generous heart, he stepped back. Bullshit, they dragged his ass and embarrassed him. He was, we don't have a president right now.
Right.
I guess this is what I wish
It's crazy. We really don't know who's running the country. That's something everyone agrees on.
Said out right there now. And here's the one that scares me, is it's a charade about he's there and you can kind of make jokes about it. But what we're being told about what's happening in Ukraine with Russia and U.S., in my mind, it's categorically a proxy war. That same George Bush knows that promised they wouldn't move NATO any closer to Russia when the Soviet Union disbanded. The war hawks all got it and then pushed, and Gorbachev and we said we won't go any more towards you with ours. They immediately and have been going, and now right up on the rim. Anyway, so that story that Kamala Harris is telling, and anybody in office, anybody in our power structure, save a few. I've actually heard there's a few. They don't ever get much press. Are telling us and buying into bullshit and about we gotta go. China's aggression. They don't ever say what it is, but the menace has been built up by design. Oh my God, the Chinese are doing that. The Chinese are doing it. Never what might have prompted them to be doing what. Same thing going on in Israel right now. And it's on the brink of, they're discussing putting U.S. long-range missiles right in Ukraine. So that's a nuclear nation putting a weapon in a non-nuclearized nation.
Right.
And so they can then, and they can't even know how to operate this unless the UK and the US provide GPS data. So it would be a collaborative attack into Russia. And Putin has said about 3 days ago in a little 4-minute kind of thing to his National Security Council, grave threat, our national sovereignty, we changing our nuclear policy.
Wow. That's terrifying.
And even if the missile comes from the non-nuclear state, but it's put there and run and collaborated in by a nuclear state, we will consider that an attack on our nation.
If they did the same thing and put like a nuclear station in Canada.
No shit. It
actually happened. I mean, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. Very well put. And so you think about that is how what's happening. Oh, and then add to that the climate disasters as we sit here in North Carolina, western North Carolina, out of water and out of power and don't have cell phone service and all kind of wild stuff going on there. The climate disasters. And what but the Pentagon and NATO forces, which are nothing but puppet forces for U.S. exploitation and domination. Anyway,
it's so strange to me that like most Americans don't really know about Eastern European culture.
Correct.
We wouldn't know specifically about Nicaraguan culture, and so to me, the fact that our military that we're so influential over other countries, actually seems kind of inherently anti-democratic, because if we can't possibly know what the best interest
Right.
of Nicaraguans is, or we can't possibly know what the best interest of Eastern Europe is, then how can our lawmakers think that being elected by the U.S. population only gives them the credibility to govern
The world.
Yeah, like
That's a key point. That's a key point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a key point. We don't have to and shouldn't.
Right.
In fact, it violates international laws. And then the U.S. doesn't just then go make speeches. We keep from the public, and by reframing, and send in forces to overthrow whatever real stuff, is going on. But back to Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, we were attacking them, but the way Reagan and would say on the stage is the domino effect. They're still doing it. Oh, Nicaragua, if those Sandinistas get in there, they'll then take over the rest of Central America, and then before you know it, they'll be in the bottom of Florida. That's the same concept they use every time. Is, look, we're being defensive by lying out of the White House, violating Congress, shipping drugs back and forth to pay for those weapons, selling cocaine and stuff here in the U.S. to have so it could be money to fund the millions in this military operation without it coming from Congress and being subject to accountability and oversight. It was called this is the way William Casey is, off the shelf, a little operation unit, standalone, self-financing foreign affairs, foreign policy, and it was dirty, all of it.
Yeah.
It was killing. So if anything, if you do that, then,
So money laundering.
Money laundering and all that stuff.
I mean, that's literally what money laundering is if, like, a private company did it. So you don't want to say you're funding something directly, then find a way to make it look like it's self-funding.
Yeah.
So that way the money's
take
seen
the
as...
money illicitly and nobody kind of knows. But I guess and maybe we should wrap up, or maybe you have some other questions. But there's so many essential, if you will, mountain of facts and reality and history that are important to being able to make the most confident, ration and yet passion and justice grounded decisions that you think, you can't, you shouldn't, you got to know a lot of that. But also, let's snap out of what, like we were just talking about, there's something fundamentally amiss now with the Trump and Harris dialogue, so-called, because none of them, and the one that's doing the best version of talking about the existential reality, at least with regard to war, is Trump, of all people. And also know that some of that are so-called conservatives, even the libertarians, which I don't agree with libertarian much, but they've got the best and honest understanding of foreign policy and feel that this current policy is reckless and endangering the planet.
I think it's because the Kamala Harris liberals have a lot of confidence in this, like, rhetoric about, like, ideals. Like, defending Ukraine is not just about, like, the defending Ukraine specifically. It's about defending democracy itself by defending Ukraine.
Which is the big lie.
And so people who are susceptible to that type of thinking are now being duped into voting for someone who's actually, like, the real life effect is more warlike and more human destruction. And I guess my last question is, when you have a system that's as complex as the U.S. system, there's layers of bureaucracy, right? There's competitive jurisdictions. This makes it harder to identify individual moral culpability, because, and so I'm curious. I'm so curious what your thought is as a lawyer, because this whole time we've talked about what it means to have a just society, what it means to have a moral society. Yeah. But if somebody's doing something immoral and unjust, but they're doing it because whatever administration they're part of is unjust and doing it immorally, then does that make the individual culpable in some way? Or how exactly do you determine what an individual's culpability is
Right.
in unjust systems, because there's always the argument that, oh, I was just following orders, like I was just following the
Nuremberg
policy.
trial was trying to say we have to follow having our own sense, grounded in what is not just me and my tribe, but trying to ground that in the same. If you were taking the oath to defend the Constitution, you could define defending the Constitution might mean being John Brown and going to fight violently to fight back against slavery as a white guy. So you have to keep sorting out.
I see. Well, Louis, tell us.
Have a balance.
I guess that's all the questions I have. But tell us where can we buy your book? Is it just at Scoopernong or a publisher?
Jason, the author, and I urge people to buy from their private independent bookstore if you can, because it supports it. It's available through Amazon and all that other stuff. Just put the title in, The Life of a Movement Lawyer, and there'll be a bunch of options. Some of them you can go and it's on sale in Japan for $77.
In Japan?
Well, and that's not because I'm not suggesting anybody's read it there. There's just this crazy market stuff that it's meaningless prices out there. So the book is $35. It's a university press. It's hardback book, so it's expensive. It's $35.
I guess it might become like a collector's item in Japan or something. That's so funny.
No, I wasn't suggesting anybody had read it in Japan.
Louis, it's been a real pleasure.
pleasure.
We can. I know you have to go soon, so
Roman.
let's wrap it up here.
Okay.
But thank you. This was a fascinating discussion.
Great, thank you. Bye.